if you're an alpha wide receiver, you're going to draw a big time target share. So I think like for me, the writing's on the wall with the target share. Then you talk about the air yard share where Tyreek's not giving you enough air yard share to like offset the lack of targets. So I think you might actually be right. It's sort of a father time is undefeated. And it's sort of like all of our 30 plus wide receivers, it's sort of like Survivor this year. And they took out Stephon Diggs. Devontae Adams has seen some regression and Tyreek Hill. So it's really like, it's hard for us to kind of fathom these guys that we're so used to dominating fantasy, but it's really been a downhill struggle for a few of these guys this year.
What?
Why are you shaking your head? You're welcome.
Thanksgiving week in the NFL. We're here, but before we talk about Thanksgiving week and we talk about week 13, Scott, we've got to talk about the awful wide receiver scoring in week 12. We knew it was going to be a choppy week. We knew there was all these teams on bye, but what we didn't know is Justin Jefferson was going to completely get shut out. And he wasn't the only one. Multiple wide receivers, big letdown performances. Another clunker from Marvin Harrison Jr. Tyreek Hill doing nothing while Jonnu Smith and Jalen Waddle combined for a 50% target share. What is going on with our wide receivers, Scott?
Yeah, it's not just week 12. It's not just Justin Jefferson, but it's been a weird, disappointing year for wide receivers on the whole. Right now, there's only 2 wide receivers with at least 200 fantasy points. Ja'Marr Chase with 251. Amon-Ra St. Brown just barely qualified, 203.6. But this time last year, there were 8 wide receivers with 200 plus fantasy points for the first 12 weeks of the season. And so, yeah, it's a mixture of a bunch of things. It's just like scoring down on the whole. A lot of it, I think, is a lot of the best offenses now also have really good defenses. And so teams like the Lions, Vikings, ranked Vikings, top 7 in pass attempts per game last year. Lions, middle of the pack in dropbacks per game. They're now, bottom 7. So that has a pretty big impact. And then it's also a lot of injuries. So many players, Nico Collins, AJ Brown, Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua missed time. And then you also have, would-be league winners like Chris Godwin, Rashee Rice missing time and not coming back. And so, yeah, it's been a pretty disappointing, pretty underwhelming year for wide receivers. The ones I singled out in this article were the ones getting drafted really early and pretty underwhelming to expectations. Justin Jefferson, Tyreek Hill, Marvin Harrison Jr., Deebo Samuel. I don't know if there's one you wanted to pick out and start off with.
Well, I mean, they're sort of all sort of depressing. Tyreek Hill is one that a lot of people are excited for on Thanksgiving. I'll say Justin Jefferson won. Chicago's been shutting down wide receivers routinely, and it's been one of the most difficult teams for QB1 performances, one of the most difficult teams to get eke out even top 24 wide receiver performances. You're just not used to Justin Jefferson. Maybe he's a little bit less matchup proof this season, and we're not getting those insane spike weeks to sort of offset it. We're getting solid fantasy numbers, but we're not getting like the, hey, it's okay, he scored 40 for me 2 weeks ago, so I'll deal with it. The Tyreek one, though, talk about that one, because that one also coincided with a very successful game for the Miami Dolphins passing game.
Yeah, I think it's just over for Tyreek Hill. I don't think there's any other way to put it. When Jonnu Smith has supplanted you as the team's number 1 receiver by a significant margin, and not only that is, he's getting him alongside Devon Achane are getting all the screen targets that used to be such a staple of Tyreek Hill's fantasy production, where he's routing up the league's best cornerbacks. He's putting them on roller skates. He's breaking their ankles. And then he's also getting those screens, which he's turning into a lot of yak, and it's bolstering his weekly floor. And he just doesn't have that anymore. That's going to Achane, that's going to Jonnu. And it's just bad. It's bad by every measure. You look at his numbers by AS, a major departure from previous seasons. And so I think he's lost a step. And I think I think McDaniel has basically conceded as much based on his usage and deployment of Hill. And it's really just like as simple as this. In zero alternate dimensions, would Jonnu Smith outgain a prime Tyreek Hill? Ergo, he's no longer in his prime. And so what is he for fantasy? I don't know, like a mid-range wide receiver 2, with most of that just being name brand recognition. It's rough out here.
Yeah, so I have Fantasy Points data open every single time that we record with one another, and I have it open pretty much all day long, no matter what content I'm doing. And you get to look at it for free right now. So if you're listening to this podcast and you want to dive into average separation score, you want to dive into air yard share, you want to dive into pretty much any metric that Scott references on this podcast or I reference on this podcast, you have access to it for free. So, Scott, I have it open right now, and I'm looking at Tyreek Hill for the season, and I think you're right. There's a couple of very troubling signs. It's really, for me, it's the target share percentage. And people are going to say, Theo, Scott, don't you guys remember Tua was out for all these weeks? But at the end of the day, look at CeeDee Lamb. Look at what CeeDee Lamb's able to do target share wise, no matter who the quarterback is. Like, if you're an alpha wide receiver, you're going to draw a big time target share. So I think, like, for me, the writing's on the wall with the target share. Then you talk about the air yard share, where Tyreek's not giving you enough air yard share to like offset the lack of targets. So I think you might actually be right. It's sort of a father time is undefeated, and it's sort of like all of our 30 plus wide receivers. It's sort of like Survivor this year, and they took out Stephon Diggs. Devontae Adams has seen some regression, and Tyreek Hill. So it's really like, it's hard for us to kind of fathom these guys that we're so used to dominating fantasy, but it's really been a downhill struggle for a few of these guys this year. We're still hanging on with Cooper Kupp. Cooper Kupp is still doing it for us, but would you kind of agree that it's a little bit could just be age?
Yeah, and I did want to say one thing on this. Adam Harstead wrote, I think, like one of the best fantasy football articles all time, where the TLDR is he dug into age curves, and it's really not. A lot of people think of it as, you're on this like steady decline and you can kind of see it coming, but it doesn't really work like that. You can go from freakishly elite to just average, below average, to horrible. And we've seen that time and time again. And Tyreek Hill might now become the best example of that, where last year his yards per route run was the best in fantasy points data history. This year, or since week 2, he ranks behind Jonnu Smith, behind Jalen Waddle, tied with Devon Achane. And that is crazy. It's just a dramatic fall off. I mean, we talked a lot last week about the sports psychology component of this and some theories. But yeah, I mean, I think he's lost a step. I think that's reflected in his ass. I think that's reflected in his usage. I think there's just no other explanation for it. And I was kind of bullish last week. It was the best possible matchup. Man coverage, single high coverage, which, is perfect for Tyreek. And what was it? It was the Jonnu show once again. So pretty pessimistic from here on out.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I know that a lot of people are really excited about this Thanksgiving Day game. We're going to talk about all the Thanksgiving Day games. We're also going to dive into Scott's everything report, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this insane sale over at Fantasy Points. I'm going to have Scott clarify, because I think I might be misreading this one. It's that good of a sale. Scott, the everything report, you write it every single week. It's absolute fire. Great article, useful information to pretty much anyone who plays fantasy. And even if you're like very much in the know, you're grinding, you're consuming a lot of content, no matter who you are, if you read the everything report, you're going to pick up on something cool, something that can help you win in fantasy. And Scott, with the sale that Fantasy Points has this week, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about it?
Yeah, so right now the Fantasy Points data suite is free for anyone to try out. You don't have to have an email. You don't have to give us a credit card, nothing like that. Just go to data.fantasypoints.com, play around with your heart's content, see what all the hype is about. This has been a crazy, awesome year for us and for Fantasy Points data. And so I'm sure you've seen all about it on social media, or you read any of my content, you see me referencing various stats. So now you can play around with it yourself. And then our Black Friday sale, which is active right now, I think all the way to Cyber Monday, is like crazy. I think maybe it was, I kind of want to do like the cheesy commercial guy from the 80s where it's like, our prices are out of control, I should be institutionalized. So a standard subscription, which would give you access to the everything report, is only $3 for a standard subscription. And I think there's a ton of value to that. If you're in the playoff hunt, these are the money weeks, right? And, maybe one under the radar player, I'm going to tell you to pick up one of these weeks, could be the difference between you winning or losing your championship. $10 for a premium sub. So if you're a DFS player or better, really good odds that you're just going to make that $10 back immediately. And then $40 for an all-in package. It's the same thing. And this is just for the remainder of the year. No gimmicks, no catches, just really cheap, just because, not for the remainder of the year. It's until, I think, March 31st. So don't forget, we recommend bets. We have DFS content all throughout the playoffs and the Super Bowl. So really good value. Encourage you guys to check that out.
Yeah, and you'll get to read my Dynasty or rankings, my Dynasty articles every single week. Scott's everything report, pretty much everything. And Scott, when you say it goes up until like March 31st, you're going to get some very cool 2025 prospect stuff. You're going to get all sorts of like early offseason stuff that can help you out as a fantasy manager as well, because it doesn't really stop. It goes all year long now, and we love it. But let's dive right back into it. Let's talk about what we're looking at for week 13. And in order to do so, let's kind of take away a little bit more from week 12. So we started out the show on sort of like a negative note with all these wide receivers that were really putting up clunkers. But let's talk a little bit about Tua Tagovailoa, because we referenced the success of the Miami Dolphins passing game. Tua's fully healthy, fully back. There's a big game for fantasy managers this week. The Dolphins playing on Thanksgiving against the Green Bay Packers. What's your trust level for Tua Tagovailoa specifically? Because you're starting to see a couple of these quarterbacks really becoming fantasy viable. You have a Brock Purdy injury. You're going to have multiple quarterbacks on bye week in week 14, where you've got guys like Jayden Daniels on a bye, Lamar Jackson on a bye, our guy Bo Nix on a bye. So where are you at with Tua and your trust level for him moving forward?
Yeah, I'm pretty confident in him as a low-end QB1. 6 full games this year, 18.8 fantasy points per game, would rank 8th best. 3rd best in pass rating since he came back in week 8. What is it? 600 passing yards, 7 touchdowns just these last 2 weeks. And he's doing all this without Tyreek Hill being Tyreek Hill. He's doing it with, Jonnu Smith as the number 1 receiver, and it's working. Meanwhile, like the running game isn't what it's typically looked at like in a Mike McDaniel offense. And so they're forced to lean heavier on Tua, and it seems to be working out well. So yeah, low end QB1. I feel good about that.
Yeah, I think that's about right. And the Dolphins are still like going for it. They're still playing well. They had their down stretch, and it's sort of like they've got their groove back. And I know you referenced Tyreek, but he's still serviceable. Now you have Jalen Waddle having his best game of the season. Devon Achane, we're going to talk about a little bit later. This is a team where there's multiple weapons. They're starting to move the ball again. It was like all these weeks where they were completely unusable, and now it's back to, hey, let's trust some Dolphins. That's going to be a really, really fun one against Green Bay. I mentioned Jayden Daniels. Now, Jayden Daniels has his bye week coming up in week 14. They play the Tennessee Titans this week, but he had his best game fantasy-wise as a pro. It was an absolutely wild game against the Dallas Cowboys. There was like a ton of late fourth quarter scoring that sort of propelled this massive output. But Daniels did a couple of things that were very fantasy friendly. He gave us not only a depending on your scoring system, he's around QB1 this week, but it was a big time performance for him, his best performance since week 3. And now with Jayden Daniels, we also see a big rushing output, which people have sort of been poking holes at the lack of like big time rushing spike weeks, but he gave you one this past week. And when you look at Daniels, like, you have to love the playoff schedule coming up. The New Orleans Saints in week 15 in New Orleans. Daniels obviously was an absolute stud, won the Heisman at LSU. Have to figure he's going to get a lot of love playing down in New Orleans and a comfort level of playing in the Superdome on the turf against a pretty generous run defense. And then the Atlanta Falcons in week 17 in a home game with potentially some playoff ramifications for Washington. You have to love that as well. Your trust level with Daniels, was this a one-off sort of event, or is this Daniels wheels up rest of the season spike weeks?
Yeah, absolutely. Wheels up rest of the season, easy mid-range QB1 at worst. I think what happened was he was dealing with that rib injury, so he was running less, and that's obviously a core component of his fantasy value. And then these last 2 weeks, he's been dealing with an injury to his throwing hand. It was an open wound that had to be super glued closed. I'm a little worried he's not totally over that, just because prior to that Terry McLaurin miracle touchdown catch, where like 80% of those yards came after the catch, it was like one of his worst passing performances of the season, up against a Dallas Cowboys defense that looked like one of the worst pass defenses in football. And then before that, the week before that, he had an absolutely pathetic 3.7 ADOT. But again, the rib injury, it looks like he's over. Edwin's not worried about it. Edwin's our injury expert. Hand injury, probably over it or very close to it. Edwin's not at all worried about it. So yeah, top 5 option this week, every week moving forward. If you're a Fantasy Point subscriber, you probably have him on like 100% of your leagues. And so you just ran a little bad with the rib injury, this hand injury, but just still feel as convicted as ever on Jayden Daniels.
Yeah, and Jayden Daniels is second among all quarterbacks in rushing yardage this season. That's a huge win, and sort of was the thesis behind drafting him. But this past week, where this was really like a breath of fresh air type game, and it's not uncommon that we see rookies go through like tough spots. It sort of speaks volumes to Jayden Daniels that people were upset about multiple like low end QB1 weeks. And that Pittsburgh and Philadelphia stretch was difficult, but I think we're back. And again, that bye week gives a chance for Washington to sort of get things going. They come right out of the bye week with New Orleans. You have to love that one. Let's also talk a little bit about Matt Stafford, because this is one where, we've talked about wide receiver consolidation on this show, about how condensed the target tree is in LA. It's back-to-back weeks, Scott, where Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp have had the highest combined target share. And again, you have access to all this sort of data right over at Fantasy Points Data. You can check it out right now. But all I do is I pull up the advanced receiving screen and I type in Rams and I look at it myself. And these two guys are absolutely cooking. But there's not enough discussion about Matt Stafford. And Matt Stafford, this is one you wrote about in the Everything Report. This is a player that I think is a little bit underrated, especially as like a streaming quarterback the rest of the season.
Yeah, this again, we talked about this a lot last week, how condensed it is. To just update one of those stats, Puka Nacua ranks first, Cooper Kupp ranks second among all receivers and targets per route run. Insanely concentrated offense. But yeah, Matthew Stafford, since they returned to the lineup, what is it, 5 weeks ago?
Yeah.
He leads all quarterbacks in passing yards, ranks second in passing touchdowns, 20.5 fantasy points per game. And yeah, I think this sticks. We saw the same thing last year when Kupp, Puka, Kyren were all on the field together. This wasn't just the most efficient offense in football. It was a historically efficient offense. And so, yeah, I'd bet on this continuing. I'm a big DFS guy. I'm going to be playing a ton of Matthew Stafford double stacks every week. And yeah, really exciting.
Yeah, I agree with you. Stafford's sort of one of those where you never feel super excited about starting him. But if you have a Kupp or a Nacua and you get that sort of correlation, especially in a fantasy football playoff, like you referenced DFS, but I think a lot of people listening in love having that correlation play in like a elimination type event, like a fantasy football playoff matchup. And a lot of leagues are still single elimination, where that could be a combination that absolutely runs hot. I'm totally with you on that one. I love sometimes in the everything report where you just make some reference, and I'm like, that's very funny, Scott. And you had to reference the Vietnam era as well as Jamal Charles to sort of reference the efficiency that Saquon Barkley is displaying. Like, I think it's pretty cut and dry. We're going to be doing some early 2025 talk in the next upcoming weeks, but I think the top two draft picks next season are going to be Saquon Barkley and Ja'Marr Chase in pretty much every single league. And I think Saquon now, it's kind of hard not to take him at the 101, Scott. What he did in week 12 was insane. 255 rushing yards, sets a Philadelphia Eagles record. And when you talk about home run hitting, Saquon had two 70-yard runs in the same game. He has 6 rushes over 40 yards this year. No other player in the NFL has more than 3. So he's just lapping the field in so many categories. And he's also been vultured so many times by his own quarterback around the goal line. I mean, this could be like the best fantasy season in the history of the game, and it's still looking like one of the best running back seasons ever. Sort of, how can you quantify Saquon Barkley? Like, everybody knows he's doing great, but what are a couple takeaways from Scott Barrett on Saquon's insane season?
Yeah. The stat you referenced, his 6.24 yards per carry, ranks second best since the Vietnam War, behind only Jamal Charles. That was from Ryan Heath. But I know he made that stat just for me, because that's my favorite reference point for any stat is making it since the Vietnam War, since the Reagan administration. So that's just the way to my heart. But yeah, what he's doing is just absolutely insane. And it's so funny because so many fantasy analysts, and I'd say, like, honestly, the best fantasy analysts were like, well, here's the thing about Saquon Barkley is that, Jalen Hurts is going to vulture the goal line carries, and Hurts doesn't target running backs. And all that's true. Like, this is not good volume. Like, he 16.9 XFP per game. That's, I don't know, 7th most among running backs. It just doesn't matter. When you're Saquon Barkley, one of the best running backs in football, and you're behind this elite offensive line, it just breaks leagues. It breaks my XFP metric, and it's objectively like one of the most impressive running back seasons we've seen in a really long time.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is more of like a reflect on it in the offseason type event, but it was such a perfect storm for running back values. I remember there was a period of time this offseason where people were upset about getting the 11th overall pick, the 12th overall pick. And at the end of the day, you could have had Saquon Barkley in literally every single draft. And there was a period of time where you could have had Ja'Marr Chase and Saquon Barkley in every single draft combined. Like, Saquon was going somewhere in that early second for a large period of the summer. Ja'Marr Chase fell down to like the 109, 110. It's just crazy to think about that. And our friend Abib Agbatoba made a really interesting comment to me this week. Abib's a great high stakes manager that Scott and I split some teams with, but it's back-to-back seasons where sort of the win rate, the player that you wanted to draft, comes from like the 1-2 turn. Last season, it was CeeDee Lamb, who you could routinely get at like the 12th or the 201. And this year, Saquon Barkley. Just very interesting to see how these things go. But Saquon Barkley, like, now we're just rooting for history. He can catch Eric Dickerson. He's going to break Shady McCoy's record in like 2 weeks for the Philadelphia Eagles all-time rushing record. I mean, just absolutely nuts. One of the better running back seasons in quite some time. And Saquon's competing for the MVP trophy at this point. So love Saquon, but there's so many running backs we need to talk about. Another interesting development we saw in week 12 was Isaiah Pacheco sort of comes out of week 12 as a fantasy football winner. And we've had this argument before where I was sort of on the Kareem Hunt and Isaiah Pacheco will, really be kind of splitting. You were on the Isaiah Pacheco is going to come back and be sort of a bell cow. I think it's looking more like you're going to be right. I'm going to have to take an L on this one. Why don't you talk a little bit about like what you saw with Kareem Hunt's usage and how this bodes well for Pacheco whenever he comes back?
Yeah, well, the usage is awesome if it's not a committee. Right now, both running backs rank top 4 at the position in XFP per game. Pacheco leads all running backs in XFP per team play. I think Hunt is right up there as well. And it's just, to me, it seems easy. It's Hunt ranks bottom 3 in all meaningful rushing metrics. Pacheco, we'll see how he looks coming off of injury, but have to think he's a major improvement for a team that wants to lean very run heavy and kind of like runs through the primary running back without historically much of a committee this season. And so, yeah, I feel good about it. I think maybe it's a committee this week, and then it's just the Pacheco show from there. But we'll have to see how he is coming off of injury.
Yeah, it's a Black Friday game, and this is one where I think you could see a little bit extra carries from Pacheco. This is a game where it sort of bodes well for Kansas City. Vegas obviously lost to Denver this past week, but it's a great opponent for them to start out with. And I also think there's a chance that Kareem Hunt's just sort of breaking down. He's 29 years old. They got an awful lot out of him. But it is a lot more volume than we ever anticipated with Hunt. When he sort of came in, we were arguing about sort of like a Carson Steele, Samaje Perine, Hunt in some sort of weird committee. It's been anything but that. So, at the end of the year, we'll look back on Kareem Hunt as one of the better waiver wire additions of the season. So you got your utility out of him, but I think it's time for Isaiah Pacheco down the stretch and in the fantasy football playoffs. Another running back who I think is set to absolutely smash this week. I on another show this week, I gave him as like my hammer play of the week, a guy who I think is going to put up a huge fantasy scoring number. And I was happy to see you're on that page in the Everything Report. Jhamyr Gibbs plays against a difficult Chicago defense on Thanksgiving Day. But it's really a David Montgomery sort of banged up argument as well. Obviously, Gibbs is incredible. He's running back 4 on the season, but David Montgomery's also an RB1. What would a limited David Montgomery have an impact on Jhamyr Gibbs? Like, let's say you get 60% of the usual touches for David Montgomery. What would that do to your Jhamyr Gibbs outlook for this week?
Yeah, so I wrote about this in the Everything Report last week, just talking about the immense upside in this backfield where it's a perfectly even 50.0 to 50.0% split by backfield XFP. And so that's really capping the upside of both players. I mean, they're both RB1s, but like Gibbs is RB6, Montgomery RB11. So clearly more efficient despite the same exact value of volume. And so I did the math, and it was basically like if it was a 70-30 split, Gibbs would be putting up, I don't know, prime LaDainian Tomlinson numbers. If it was a 60-40 split, it would be, I don't know, McCaffrey last year. And so, yeah, massive, massive upside. We'll have to wait and see, or I kind of liked your take on this, where they're saying it's a insignificant injury. He's going to be fine, but you kind of went another way with it. So I'll let you give that take out.
Yeah, so I talk a lot of shop with my guy Andrew Cooper over at Fantasy Alarm, and he's always bringing this up where whenever we hear like a rib injury or a shoulder injury to specific players, we can get away with that. Like if your game is a finesse type game, maybe you're a satellite back, maybe you are a slot wide receiver, you can get away without taking those sort of big hits and just kind of play through the pain tolerance. But when you're a back in the cloth of like a David Montgomery, or for that matter, a Josh Jacobs or a Derrick Henry, like the more physical you are, the more hits you take, the more concerning these sort of injuries are. Shoulders and ribs, a lot of it's pain tolerance. A lot of these things can flare up. And you don't watch a single game where David Montgomery like avoids hits. Like it's not like he's just shifty getting around everybody. He's taking on at least 1 or 2 hits. He's doling out punishment. He's a physical back. So I think this is one we want to circle. This could be the start of Jhamyr Gibbs. Like even if it's a limited capacity for Montgomery and they want to, and we also have to bear in mind, the Lions are on easy street right now. They have all but locked up a top 2 seed in the NFC, barring a catastrophic collapse. They're looking like a team of destiny, sort of, at least to get a top 2 seed and in a really good position to get the number 1 seed in the NFC. They could be in a position where they want to rest David Montgomery and be very cautious with him for the playoffs as well. So I think everything sort of bodes well for Gibbs. Like you said, he doesn't need to take away that much. It's not like 100% he needs to take over. If you can just take away those targets for David Montgomery, maybe take away a few carries and all of the targets, then you're talking about Jahmyr Gibbs just Saquon level numbers could happen this week. I also like the fact that Chicago's played in two very, very close games. Thomas Brown, we talked about this last week about how they sort of have rational coaching on the offensive side of the ball. They have an absolute unit of a defense. And it's been back-to-back weeks where they played the Packers within a point. They took the Vikings to overtime. But Scott, you've seen this before where those kind of like really close losses really close wins can catch up to you, but really close losses can really catch up to you. Now they go play Detroit on like Thanksgiving is the Detroit Lions. This could be a game that could get away from them. This could be Jahmyr Gibbs in the second half ripping off a 50-yard touchdown, and you've won your week, and it's Thursday. So I'm with you. It's wheels up for Jahmyr Gibbs. If you're playing DFS on Thanksgiving Day, you got to have a little bit of Jahmyr Gibbs exposure. Running back wise, I also want to talk about our guy, Devon Achane. And shout out to Ryan Heath. There's been a lot of people over at Fantasy Points who have been super bullish on him all summer long. You had him as an Exodia player. He's a guy that I have a ton of exposure to in all formats. We love Devon Achane. He makes us look very, very smart all season long. And this past week, he gets another 20-plus point performance, and he gets 2 touchdowns. So most shows are just sort of like just pounding the table, talking about another smash week for Achane. But I think what's interesting is in your everything report, you did reference a slight red flag. For me, it was the 10% target share this past week. I don't love seeing that for him. I like seeing it a little bit higher like we're used to. And then you also talked about the 53% snap share. Do you think there's anything to worry about whatsoever in terms of a somewhat reduced snap share and a reduced target share occurring on the same week? Or is this just it's a one-off event? Devon Achane is the most efficient guy, and we don't have anything to worry about.
No, I think both of those stats are alarming, and you didn't even mention the one that might be most discouraging to me, is that Mostert has seen 9 of the team's 12 goal line carries since week 8. That's not great. That's going to cap your touchdown upside for sure. But I mean, the bottom line is a player we love, freakishly hyper efficient. He's scored at least 20 fantasy points in 6 of 2 of 7 starts. And again, you are seeing kind of a demoted role for Tyreek Hill, a lot of volume going to Achane, where Tua is content to just get the ball out quick and kind of eat these defenses alive in the short to intermediate area of the field. And a lot of that is Achane, a lot of that's Jonnu. And so, yeah, I think he's still an easy mid-range RB1. If we see another week of this, maybe it's time to consider bumping him to a low-end RB1. But no, I feel good about this right now.
Yeah, for anybody who does fantasy football rankings out there, it's like fantasy law. If you rank Devon Achane too low, that's the week he's going to get 40 points, and it's going to make you look foolish. So be very careful out there if you're in like some rankings contest trying to be the contrarian guy with Devon Achane. Let's talk about a running back that we do need to downgrade. And this is assuming that there will be no Brock Purdy this week, but Christian McCaffrey. Let's talk a little bit about Christian McCaffrey. Just how much of an adjustment do we need to make with not only McCaffrey, but this entire San Francisco 49ers offense? It was ugly. The Packers completely steamroll them.
Yeah, it's not good. I mean, he was without Brock Purdy, which isn't great. I think the more impactful absence might be Trent Williams. The on-off splits last year for San Francisco without him were crazy, where it wasn't just like Brock Purdy going from like a near perfect touchdown to interception ratio to one of the worst, but it was also, you saw Christian McCaffrey's yards before contact absolutely crater. And so he had a lot of things working against him. I think if both players are out, probably a low end RB1. If either one comes back, I'd say mid-range RB1, because it's still McCaffrey. It's still, this crazy snap share, can be heavily involved in both phases of the game. But yeah, when you're down both those players, it's not great. And, longer term, what we have to be worried about is, 49ers getting farther and farther away from playoff contention. And you have this stud older running back with Achilles issues. I worry about him getting shut down, but barring that, I mean, every week he's going to rank as an RB1 for me.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned sort of the combined absence of Trent Williams and Brock Purdy. You also have the notion that if Purdy comes back before Williams, the Brock Purdy Trent Williams splits, like those are really very alarming for sort of Purdy himself, and
Yeah.
that kind of downgrades the entire offense. But you nailed it. It's sort of like there's only a point where you can drop McCaffrey down to, even with poor quarterback play, because he's so dynamic and he's so efficient as a receiver. And also that Green Bay team, really, really good one. That I don't think it's going to be nearly as bad every single week. It's sort of like also sometimes you see these backup quarterbacks come in and the first week is just a disaster, and then things sort of settle a little bit better. Look at what happened with the Cooper Rush, where it was like everything is completely falling apart. And now there's been two sort of like ridiculously horrible games. They've been actually very solid passing yardage numbers from Rush. So maybe we see some slight improvement there. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot to worry about with the San Francisco team. This was the Super Bowl favorite heading into the season. And like you said, they're fighting for their lives right now just to make the playoffs on the outside looking in. Let's talk about another running back in the NFC West, and that's Kyren Williams. And Kyren Williams has a legitimate fumbling issue this season. You saw untimely fumbles against Philadelphia this past week. He's also seeing fewer targets as a receiver. So there's multiple concerns fantasy-wise with a player that we were really hanging our hats on early in the season. This is a guy where we talked about this last week with sort of the increased passing numbers for the wide receivers have sort of downgraded Williams. We took a semi-optimistic outlook here. But the fumbles, though, Scott, that's one where we haven't seen Blake Corum or another running back getting like opportunities. But there has to be a point where if these fumbles continue, you might see another back mixed in.
Someone on Twitter called Kyren Williams a Sean McVay loves him merchant, which I thought
I think that was Jacob Sanderson. And I'll say, this is like people don't like using this word. A little bit of a compiler. He's a kind of a compiler in a really good offense. It's not like you look at Kyren Williams and you're like dumbfounded by the talent. You're not dumbfounded by the athleticism. He does certain things well in an unbelievably well-designed scheme. And he's very good around the goal line for a smaller back. But it's not like you look at him and you're like, this guy is the greatest back in football. Am I kind of off on this one? Like,
no, I think you're right. I don't think he's special, but I'm saying none of it matters if it doesn't matter. Like the fumbling doesn't matter if it doesn't matter to McVay, because this is a running back who leads the league in snap share. He fumbled and Blake Corum still saw 7 snaps, 1 touch on the day. And so you have this super valuable goal line role. You're getting all these carries. I will just say, the lack of targets hurts you. It makes you more volatile on a week-to-week basis, makes you more game script dependent. Also, the goal line work, easily led the league in red zone XFP per game last year, and then up until Cooper Kupp's return this season. That's come down a bit. That's going to hurt him a lot as well, because that's just been a major piece to his fantasy output. I don't know. He's like a low end RB2 RB1 right now, high end RB2 right now. Just because of, the lack of targets and the red zone role diminishing, but I'm not worried about the fumbles.
Somewhere in the multiverse, the Rams waited one extra round and they drafted Bucky Irving, and Bucky Irving just took the job last week away from Kyren Williams.
Well, Bucky Irving was my this year's Kyren Williams comp, so that would have been
perfect. No, I love it. And Bucky, we could spend a tremendous amount of time on. We've got to hit a couple more of these running backs, and we're going to dive into the wide receiver position. Make sure you're subscribing to the podcast and all the great podcasts from Fantasy Points, and make sure you're checking out Fantasy Points data. It's free this week. You can look at everything that Scott references in the Everything Report, and everything we talk about on this show data-wise is available to you for free this week. Check it out. Let's talk about a player that I didn't think we'd talk about all season long, but Jeremy McNichols is sort of set up for a really fun game. I had him as a top 3 waiver wire addition this week. You've got multiple things. Whenever you talk about like a number 3 back, a lot of different things have to happen at once for them to get this opportunity. But you have Austin Eckler dealing with concussion. And then you have Brian Robinson, who missed time already this season with a hamstring, is now dealing with ankle issues. You might have Jeremy McNichols leading the backfield right next to Jayden Daniels. And it's not like McNichols has done nothing this year. Has 4 touchdowns on the season. Where would you be at on a single spot start with McNichols? Would you want access to him in DFS? Would you be comfortable putting him in as your running back 2, your flex? Where you at?
Yeah, certainly a flex play. Maybe, I don't know, maybe a low end RB2. You have to feel good about it. This is a very valuable backfield. Austin Eckler racking up the targets, Brian Robinson, the carries, goal line work. And it looks like McNichols really might get all of it if both of them are out. They have no one else. They just waived Chris Rodriguez. They have Michael Wiley and Kazmir Allen. I barely know who those guys are.
You made up Kazmir Allen. That was a made up name for the Everything Report.
Nope. And so, yeah, I could really see him being a bell cow, and, you know, like Amir Abdullah, 88% snap share, something like that. Just not the typical production or efficiency when, you know, Brian Robinson, really good early down runner, Austin Eckler, really good pass catcher. He's not that, but just on raw volume alone, I'm pretty excited about McNichols.
So McNichols, I agree with you. This is an exciting spot start. And you also we love a revenge game narrative going up against his former team. That's always a little bit of extra motivation for NFL players. Don't kid yourself. People say revenge games don't matter. Revenge games do matter. But let's talk about a couple of running backs that we actually need to downgrade. Who are you most concerned about? Tyrone Tracy, DeAndre Swift, or Ramondre Stevenson? Which of these players, if you had to start 2 and you had to bench 1 for the rest of the season, who would you bet on?
I would definitely most worried about DeAndre Swift. We've really seen his snap share plummet under the new offensive coordinator, Thomas Brown. He's not getting any goal line carries. Really brutal rest of season strength of schedule. So definitely like him the least.
Yeah, I think I'm with you. I was very, very tilted about the Devon Singletary getting that late touchdown. If Tyrone Tracy would have just gotten that late touchdown, I think we would have all breathed a sigh of relief. But it was like, I'm ready for Brian Dable to be out the door. I know there's a big segment of people.
So is Malik Neighbors, it sounds like.
Yeah, Malik Neighbors is all about that. But I know it's very weird. There's like some fantasy analysts out there where they're so quick to like get on the like Brian Dable is so smart. Brian Dable's going to get another job if the Giants move on from him. I'm like, I don't know about this. Like, this guy's supposed to be some sort of offensive genius. And yeah, where in the offensive genius handbook does it say to not target Malik Neighbors in the entire first half and to move off of Tyrone Tracy and get more touches for like your guy, Devin Singletary, was very like punitive for like a rookie mistake in the previous game. So like, I don't know. I'm completely off Dable. It makes me depressed to even talk about him. Who do you want to coach the Giants next year if they do move on?
Bill Belichick. And I think it's going to happen. I think that's where he wants to go. So Bill is like an unemotional robot, right? Never smiles, never, immense disdain for the media. There was this documentary with him and Bill Parcells where they go to Giant Stadium. Maybe it was before it became MetLife Stadium. I don't remember, but they do a tour of like the Jets locker room, and they just like trash the Jets, and they're just cracking up, making fun of how much of a Mickey Mouse organization the Jets are. And then Bill goes to the Giants locker room and he starts tearing up. Like he legitimately starts crying. He's like, so many great memories here. Such a great organization. And so I think that's where he wants. Maybe it's just me as a Giants homer, wishful thinking, but I think that's where he wants to go. Obviously there's going to be better teams with more draft capital, better roster. But I'm hoping that's what's going to happen.
No, I'm with you. He has the connection to the organization. He was the defensive coordinator under Bill Parcells.
Right.
And it's actually like, there's some things to like about that team. There's talent on he's got a pass rush on the defensive side of the ball.
Mhm.
And on the offensive side of the ball, like, to their credit, they had a very good draft. So there's some things to fix, but also sort of a low bar to cross. And I think you could end up with Bill Belichick as the Giants coach. And then the other rumor, Pete Carroll comes back and is your Jets coach. So you get
Ooh.
these two older coaches that have both won Super Bowls, both end up in New York. It's awesome. And you're right. He absolutely detests the New York Jets. This was one, if there's the Ian O'Connor, I think, is the author, the Belichick book. It's a great book, but it talks about, like, he hates the Jets. That's the
Yeah.
one franchise, like, where a lot of the beef he had with, like, Mangini and stuff was because Mangini went and took the Jets job. So, like, there's a real hatred over that Jets organization. Obviously, he, like, was supposed to get the head coaching job. We're getting really deep into the weeds here. We got to concentrate more about what's going on now, but let's root for both of those guys to come back to the NFL, shake things up in New York. Let's talk about our guy, Nico Collins. And Nico Collins, just like, quick takeaway. We saw Nico Collins put up the smash week, but 80% plus snaps played, 40% plus air yard share, 27% plus target share. Is Nico Collins, like, besides Ja'Marr Chase, the one wide receiver you'd like to have for the rest of the season?
Yes.
Yeah, me too. Anything to add, Scott, interesting wise, that I didn't cover for Nico Collins?
Yeah. So he's had a 33-yard touchdown and a 77-yard touchdown called back on penalties over the past 2 weeks. If we counted those, he'd be averaging 124.2 yards per game. And then that number needs to get adjusted up even further when we factor in he's played 2 games under a 50% snap share, one of which he left in the first quarter against the Bills. So he's really averaging, like, I forget what it was, but it was like 160 yards per game, which is like best ever. But yeah, even if you don't, like, give him the luxury of those overturned penalties, like, what he's doing is absolutely insane. It's just AJ Brown is putting together one of the most efficient per route seasons in recent memory. Nico's right behind him on an offense that's a lot more pass heavy than the Eagles that rank dead last in pass attempts per game. So yeah, I think it's Ja'Marr Chase 1. I think it's Nico 2, and number 3 is more of a tough call.
Yeah, and this week, Houston gets the Jacksonville Jaguars. So a chance
game
for
over.
Yeah, it's game over. Like, Nico's going to put up 150 and 2 touchdowns. It's going to be awesome. And, Nico Collins is one we've talked about all season. We've obviously talked about, like, the correlation play with obviously Joe Burrow and Ja'Marr Chase. We've talked about Matt Stafford and his 2 wide receivers. But really, the most underrated correlation play in fantasy football right now is our guy, Bo Nix, and Cortland Sutton. These 2 guys, Scott, since week 8, over the last 5 weeks, are both top 5 at their position. And we saw an absolute smash performance from Cortland Sutton. 8 catches, 97 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns. Denver gets the win over the Raiders. And this has just been, like, nothing but positivity out of Sutton. Cortland Sutton right now is on pace to finish as a wide receiver 1 for the first time in his career. This is a huge ADP success story, and a lot of it is Knicks, but why don't you focus a little bit on Cortland Sutton, your takeaways with him? We talked about him a couple weeks ago, and you were bullish. So, we were a little bit ahead of the curve on this one, but we should have been more, like, effusive in talking it up, but we couldn't have seen this sort of numbers.
Yeah, so he was a major regression candidate I was talking about in the XFP report. Through the first 6 weeks of the season, he ranked 13th in XFP, but just 37th in fantasy production. But over the last 5 weeks, he ranks behind only Ja'Marr Chase in fantasy points. Volume is even better than it was through those first 6 weeks. 5th best in XFP per game. He's hit 70 yards in each of these games. He never hit that prior to. And yeah, you said it's the correlation play. Yeah, Bo Nix looks like the real deal. Top 5, 21.5 fantasy points per game over his last 8 games. Sutton balling out. And so, yeah, I'm betting on this being real. And Vele, was it Devon Vele?
Devon Vele. We got Vele. Like,
thank you.
We got Devon Vele. We might have you talked about this. I had him very highly ranked in my waiver wire article, but, like, Vele had 9 targets. Vele had 80 yards receiving. This has been an offense that's sort of been, like, very much needing a consistent number 3 player to go with Nix, to go with Sutton. We've seen sort of like a revolving door at running back. There's nothing there at tight end. And wide receiver, like, Vele's funny because he had a very strong first game of the season, then dealt with some injuries, but he's like a 6'5" guy.
Was
who
it injuries? I thought he was a healthy scratch. I thought
I think
Peyton's
he was.
just a lunatic.
I think he got banged up the first game.
Okay.
I'd have to double check that one. Anybody watching on YouTube, let us know in the chat if I'm incorrect on that one. I do believe he dealt with a couple of injuries early on. But Vele's super interesting. And what is your thoughts on him? Because I think this could be a situation where he gives us like wide receiver 3 numbers for the rest of the season. I know he's super old, but there's something to like about him. And Sutton demands so much attention. Vele, they're able to use him in the slot. He's 6'5", and he's like literally like an old man. He's like 26, 27 years old.
Yeah, I just pulled it up. He had a rib injury week 2, and then I think he was off the injury report and a healthy scratch, but I might be wrong. So don't have the time to look it up. So YouTube comments, you can correct us. But yeah, dude, Vele might be nice. He ranks 4th best in AS since week 7, 62 yards per game over his last 3. This is despite just being a part-time player, 62% route share over that span. And Sean Payton comped him to Marquez Colston, and like stylistically, body type wise, I could really see that. So if Bo Nix is real, and he looks real by every metric that matters to me, Vele could definitely be a thing. So, and shout out to my guy Marvin Mims, who's like playing running back now and actually doing pretty well with it. So shout out to him as well.
Let's get Marvin Mims a few more snaps and maybe give like the Jaleel McLaughlin touches to Marvin Mims as well.
Yeah,
at running back. Nothing would make me happier than having to write a lot about Marvin Mims on the waiver wire article next week, Scott. We're not giving up hope, but Devon Vele on Fantasy Points data for the season, a 72.7% slot rate, a 6'5" player that's in the slot with a alpha on the outside commanding a lot of attention. Vele is going to get like beneficial matchups, and he's going to be a sort of a safety valve target for Bo Nix. And shout out to the people who we talked about this one, and I'll give you a big shout out because you've been on like the Bo Nix is good train for a while here, done a number of like tweets about it. But the fact that you even have to quantify it, like a couple of the people out there trying to look at like the like obscure metrics to try to like justify Bo Nix actually not being good, just pop on the tape. This kid is awesome. I don't know if he's ever going to be a top 5 fantasy quarterback like yearly, but he's a perfect fit, and he's got mobility and he's got swag. He's talking trash to the Raiders. Like, go outside, like get off of your computer a little bit, touch a little grass. It's like a go outside nerd moment. Like if you can't watch Bo Nix and realize he's pretty good by this point, like the guy's going to end up being a top 7, top 8 quarterback in fantasy, and he's going to lead his team to the playoffs in year 1. Bo Nix is good. We're putting the stamp of approval on that one. Another wide receiver who we referenced last week, your thoughts on what you saw from Adam Thielen. Made a couple of big catches. Carolina's playing better. I got to say, Carolina's offense starting to play a little bit better. They put a lot of fear into the Chiefs, and I know the Chiefs have to play down to everyone in fantasy. In real life NFL football. It's got to be a close game no matter who they're playing. But Carolina, like, some things to like there. Your thoughts on Thielen as a player who you can get in a lot of places on the waiver wire this week?
Yeah, I mean, let's not forget the guy is super old, coming off of a hamstring injury, never good. But I was watching Red Zone, and like he made 2 big plays early in that game, and he looked good. He looked spry. I was really impressed. But I mean, like the volume still wasn't there. It was David Moore who ranked top 5 among all wide receivers in XFP, 29% target share. And so, yeah, if you look at that, it's, by the way, Bryce Young is playing really well. This offense looks kind of exciting. There's definitely upside there. Thielen through the first 11 weeks of the year last year was the wide receiver 10 by fantasy points per game. So it's just kind of a matter of like, is he healthy? Like that's when you wanted to play Thielen, you know, with his advanced age, is like when he's at his healthiest. Is that going to be now coming off of a hamstring? I don't know. I'd just say wide range of outcomes, probably worthy of a roster spot in deeper leagues. But if he doesn't amount to anything, that wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, no, but I think you nailed it. I think he is worth a roster spot. You don't need to start him this week, but let's say that he goes up and becomes like an 8 target per game guy. Like the David Moore stuff was wild. Like on the drive where he caught the touchdown, Bryce Young targeted him in the end zone the play before as well. He had back-to-back end zone targets in sort of like that Jalen Coker role, but Xavier Legette has failed to be a like target magnet. Coker is banged up. Now Jatavian Sanders is banged up. It looks like it's going to be Tommy Tremble this week. So it's like Adam Thielen doesn't need to do it for an entire season. He just needs to do it for us for like 4 or 5 weeks. So old man Adam Thielen becoming a target magnet down the stretch is within the range of outcomes. You know, you talked about how good he was last year. That was Bryce Young with sort of tunnel vision for him for a lot of the season. The guy had like 100 catches. So I'm on the opinion, like, grab some Thielen, see where this goes, and you might actually want to start him in week 14 where you have all these teams on bye weeks. So I think he's a sneaky addition this week. Anything to add on Jackson Smith and Jigba? We talked about this a little bit last week, but this is the 3rd straight week in a row where JSN has scored 19 or more PPR points, and the 3rd week in a row with a 25% target share. He catches a touchdown pass. This was also a 19.7 points, I believe he scored, in sort of a very ugly game where it was like a 13-6 win. Not what we want to see for fantasy, but JSN right now is a wide receiver 1 on the season. You have to feel good about him moving forward.
Yeah, so it's the same thing I said last week, where it's like, I said Jackson Smith and Jigba when he was coming out would be Keenan Allen reincarnated, which is like, you say something like that, you better be right. And last year was so bad. It was so bad. And so I'm scared to like buy back in case I'm wrong again, and which would just break me. So like, I worried, you read the everything report. I worried I was a little too tempered with it. And I need you to just, no. This is legit. Easy wide receiver 2 rest away.
Easy. And I think he's a low end wide receiver 1 the rest of the way. Like we're here. JSN, we are absolutely here. He's a reliable target. There's going to be certain weeks where he can also manufacture his way to production. Because again, the ADOT's a little bit lower than we want to see. The yards per reception a little bit lower, but the target share, his ability to get open, and Geno Smith just leaning on him in key situations. The touchdown catch, DK Metcalf was sort of the decoy on the play. You're used to seeing like clear out plays for DK in key moments, and now it's JSN, the clear wide receiver 1 on Seattle. 2 wide receivers that we need to adjust for rest of the season. Jacoby Meyers, who you've talked about previous School of Scott episodes, and also Lad McConkey, we've talked about sort of at length. Both of those players, we need to sort of adjust our expectations in a positive way moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, Jacoby Meyers, just look at what he's done since week 3, balling out. He ranks 8th in targets per game, 13th in XFP per game, 16th in fantasy points per game. All those numbers look better when you factor in some really tough matchups over that span. Not worried about losing Gardner Minshew. AOC targeted him on 31% of his throws when they played together. McConkey, I just think he's the real deal, man. He looks great over his last 5 games, 88 yards per game, ranks 4th among all wide receivers. He's doing that on only 6 targets per game. He leads all players in ass since week 7. Dude is getting open at will. He is really freaking good. We just need Chargers to stay as pass heavy as they've been in recent weeks. And I think that's going to continue, especially after this J.K. Dobbins injury. And what would really be great is if they started targeting him at like a top 15 rate. The dude is so deserving of more targets. Anyone who watched last week's game can tell you that. His ass score hints at that as well. Let's get those targets up. Let's let him be a league winner rather than just like a pretty good low end wide receiver too.
And here's a wild idea. Instead of some of those targets to go to Quentin Johnston that he drops and Josh Palmer, why don't we hyper target Lad McConkey and see what happens? Just go nuts. Go with a Cooper Kupp-like target share every single week and see what happens. Let's talk about 2 tight ends trending up. Trey McBride. How excited are you about Trey McBride rest of the season? 40% plus target share. Really went nuts this past week. And you talk about positive regression. This is a guy who has no receiving touchdowns all season long. Where should we be at with Trey McBride? He is your tight end, what, for the rest of the season?
Tight end 2 or 3, probably.
Yeah, I think you're right there.
Yeah, but I mean, this is fluky. Like you have to score touchdowns at some point, right? I don't know what's going on with that, but the volume is amazing. He looks really good. He's in the more valuable role. This is the more valuable role than what Marvin Harrison Jr. has. He's the PPR cheat code. And so, yeah, touchdown regression is going to come. Feel really good about Trey McBride. 60% first read target share last week. Crazy.
Yeah, it's nuts. And we've talked about this on the show several times about how, like, we love to see what teams do coming out of a bye week. And like you said, it was everything was designed for McBride in this game. Like the target share numbers alone, you're talking about McBride with 40% and Marvin Harrison Jr. was like right around, I'm actually pulling it up on Fantasy Points data. Marvin Harrison Jr. was at like a 16%. So this is not what you want to see from Marvin Harrison Jr. Super disappointing season for him. This was if you could have just gone back to all of your drafts and avoided Marvin Harrison Jr. and drafted more Trey McBride and just made that adjustment where you had no exposure to Marvin Harrison Jr. and a lot more exposure to Trey McBride, that's like a teammate arbitrage win rate adjustment. And another tight end who really shined this past week was we finally saw not finally, because he had another pretty strong game, but this was the best week for TJ Hockenson. He tied for his season high in targets. He had his season high in receiving yardage. And Scott, I think the biggest key was this was a guy that's been playing sub 50% snaps. You've seen the Josh Oliver mixing in. Josh Oliver misses time, and now you see Hockenson have 65% plus snaps played. So his snap share went up. How bullish are you on Hockenson moving forward?
Yeah, not super bullish. 76% route share last week. That was up from 51%. Still less than, where he was at last year. And so I kind of want to see that stick without Oliver. To me, he's more of a mid-range to low-end tight end 1 rather than like last year. He led all tight ends in XFP per game, fantasy points per game prior to his injury. It's also like a different offense. It's because their defense is so much better. There's lower overall pass volume, but yeah, mid-range tight end 1, low-end tight end 1, somewhere around there.
Yeah, I think I'm maybe a little bit more bullish, but yeah, even still, I have him tight end 6 overall for the rest of the season, which feels about right, but it's about as high up as you can go when it comes to Hockenson. Any way you cut it, though, this is a player where you didn't have to use the high draft capital to get him. He was a guy where now you're sort of like, it's like found money. And he could influence win rates down the stretch in some of these higher stakes formats because people were able to get him in the double-digit rounds. Some drafts super late. There was like trepidation to drafting him at all in some of these leagues. So if you got Hockenson, you got to feel good about things. Thanksgiving week, Scott, what is your 101? What is the Exodia Thanksgiving food? Is there one?
Cornbread.
Sneaky answer. Cornbread. There you go. Cornbread. I'll say for me, the sneaky Thanksgiving food that doesn't get enough hype, sort of like the dark horse candidate to deliver at Thanksgiving, is some sort of a sweet potato with like the marshmallows and stuff like that. It's very underrated as a side dish. More houses should have it. What's the least favorite Thanksgiving food? The avoid at all costs.
I would go with what you just said. I don't like it with the marshmallows.
You're bashing my pick. I'm bullish. Come on.
It's way too sweet. I just need a sweet potato with some butter and we're good. The marshmallows is just way too far out of control.
Absolutely butting heads. Let us know what if you're watching on YouTube, let us know in the comments, what's your favorite Thanksgiving food? And I'll say for me, like the low level Thanksgiving food, I remember having it as a kid, like some sort of a green bean casserole with like the French fried onions on top. That's
Yeah,
very, very.
I'm with you on that.
It's archaic. It's archaic. Get rid
The
of it.
canned cranberries, that is by far the worst. Whatever
Canned
that
cranberries. Yeah, get rid of the canned cranberries. There's some people love just plopping it on a plate. Yeah, it's like a
Ugh.
Jello. It's awful. And it's also not aesthetically pleasing on the table. It's like a big loaf of like jelly. Avoid that
No,
one.
thank you.
Happy Thanksgiving. Make sure that you check out Fantasy Points. Check out the awesome sales, and make sure that you're checking out Fantasy Points data. This could be the edge that gets you over the top for the rest of your season. I think once you try it, you're going to want to sign up for it. It's absolutely awesome. We'll see you back here next week on School of Scott.